daylight is roughly 5,000 to 5,600 degrees. Okay, so you hear that, how it's defined, the temperature. It's actually bluer light. But when we walk outside and we look at something white, our brain says that is white. We come inside, and the studio might have daylight bulbs, you'll hear that term, but a lot of times inside you might have 3,200 degree, more of a golden hue. But again, do you look inside and say, it's a nice gold look? No, your brain automatically looks at something that's white and says, that's white, it's white balanced, and life is good. So we're going to explore that, but that's one thing to realize, that you're dealing with color temperature. You're also dealing sometimes with variables that you might be shooting throughout the day. The sun goes in a cloud, behind, in a cloud, out of a cloud. The color temperature changes. You start shooting in the afternoon, it's really bright, it's blue, it gets to the golden hour, it gets dark. You need sometimes to make it all look like it happened at the same point in time, so you need to be able to match your shots. So that's another reason you would color grade or color balance. And then finally, maybe you do want to stylize your image. You want to give it a look or a feel. When we look at something and it has a certain color temperature, we react differently. You hear that, the golden hour, that warm, when something is gold, it feels warmer. You see that. It's, you want to take a show and you want people to love it. You make it a little bit gold, you make it a little bit blurry, not blurry, but glowy, and people go, how wonderful. You want something to look harsh and cold, you pull the color out, you turn it a little bit blue. And it gives a different feel, a visceral feel. So you're giving a look to a show or to a shot to emote from your audience. A lot of the controls that we have in the Lumetri color filter are exactly the same ones that you're used to for correcting your still photos. And then we're going to layout of my workspace, specifically do a default for color correction. Okay, we've learned we can modify these to our specific needs. This is the default for color correction. You can again modify it, though I think out of the box it's pretty good. So I'm going to switch back and forth so you can see how things jump around. So what we've done here is, because we're basically working with fixing the color, we're not editing our show. Again, don't need a lot of space for our project. We're not bringing any. Other thing that's here, if you look up in the upper left-hand corner, it says Lumetri or Lumetri scopes. And by the way, I asked the guys at Adobe, and they say call it whatever you want as long as they use it. So you'll hear both Lumetri and Lumetri, and I don't think there is an official way to say it. But what this allows me to do is look at my image in a series of graphical representations. And there's 4 basic ones that we use, and you can open these up if you go up under the wrench. I'm going to open up all 4 so you can see them. I'm going to explain what they're used for. We're not going to dig too deep into it, but I want to give you this as a reference. So underneath presets, you have a choice of these vector scope, histogram parades, and waveform. Under presets, I believe I can actually have a preset for all 4. And we're going to do, we'll do speed grade. Okay. So vector scope. What this is this is telling me about the color information in my shot. So the more saturated the color, the further out this gray area goes. If you look closely, you can see that there's a little box that has a Y for yellow, R for red, magenta, blue, cyan, green. The 6 basic colors and secondary colors that make up the color space that we're working in. So if I look at this, I can see there's a lot of yellow and red in my scene, a little bit of blue. If I actually bring this down and I look at my image, yeah, I see a lot of yellow, a little bit of red. It's probably mixed into the background, a little bit of blue. But it lets me look at how saturated it is and how much of each color there is. And we're going to look at a bunch of different images to help you read that a little bit better. Okay, you have this called, I'm going to actually go to this one, which is our waveform. And that just deals with luminance, okay, just how bright parts of the scene are. And if I look at this actually and I play it, okay, you'll notice there's not a lot of movement, but as the ship moves, little things happen. And I have actually a nice diving shot that's a little bit better. Okay? This lot of blue, okay, this is leaning towards blue. If I look at this, this is the luminance value. So you want your, ideally everything to be somewhere between 0 and 100%. Okay? Over 100, you're going to lose detail. And in some cases, I don't want to stretch it to 100 because this was never super bright. But it gives me a range to work with. Okay? The closer this is, or the more clumped this is, that means that there's less dynamic range, less bright and dark diversity. So sometimes you want to open that up, okay, because you want greater dynamic range in your image. And this is telling you that graphically. This is the same thing as this broken down into the red, green, and blue color space. So this is called an RGB parade. Its luminance value is based upon those three color elements. And you can see there's a lot of blue in this shot. And there's supposed to be blue in that shot. So this really doesn't need much correction. But if I looked at a picture of a building in the middle of the day and I saw a lot of blue here, the odds are I look at the picture, it'd be very blue. And it might be because my color balance was off in the camera. Okay? So you use these for references. And this is the histogram that many of you may be familiar with in Photoshop. And basically, a histogram tells you contrast. You can look at these in a variety of ways. In some people like to look at them broken down into the color space. I could also look at some of these with no chroma. So I just want to look at it white. So this is, and we're not going to dig too deep into this, but people may see this and go, what's the difference with this stuff? Color space. 601, 709, and 2020. This is the color space of three different types of televisions. Okay, 601 was the traditional standard definition television. Okay, it had a certain color space, the gamut, you know, the way the blacks looked, the dynamic range of the color, all certain specs. It got wider and different. 709 is high def. 2020 is the 4K ultra high def new flavor. So you're probably going to be working in 709, and that's what it's going to be defaulting to because you're doing widescreen for computers, for televisions. You're not going back to a square 3x4 television. Okay? And it just basically adjusts the scopes so the scopes work with your images. Don't have to really worry about that, but in the case that was a question. And I switched to pure colors. This is pure red, pure blue, pure green. Did you like the fact that I had to look at the colors to remember what RGB stood for? But if I look at this as pure red, if I look here at my RGB parade, which is luminance broken down into the three areas, no blue and green at all. They're at 0. This is at 100%. I can also look at what is really the luminance value of just red in here. You know, it's running at 30%. We wouldn't use this to adjust our scope. This is more so you can understand these, understand the scopes. We have a little dot there. It's 100% red. Okay, it's right there. It's very clean. And then, you know, we don't even have to worry about the histogram because it's not even needed for what we're doing. But what I want to see is I switch over to blue. So there, the blue is at 100%. Green is at 100%. The luminance values are slightly different, but when combined, they make pure white. Okay, if I have pure white, we see red, green, and blue all the way at the top. We see 100% luminance. Again, not a big diversity in that histogram there. I also want to point out that when something is pure white, it has no color. So this dot's right in the middle, whereas before you saw it jumping around to the little target that it needed to for blue. So this is just, again, to get your head wrapped a little bit better around how to read these scopes. Pure black, this is at 0. These are all at 0. Again, color doesn't make any difference. Gray. Gray is made up of 50% green, red, and blue, as expected. So you can see how the colors are built. And just so you get a little sense for, you know, the going from black to white, you can see, again, there's no color. We see our histogram is starting to look a little better. And then there we go. When we're looking at this, it's basically looking at the luminance values from left to right. And then you would add those together. And that's a real quick overview. Your goal is to make your shots match and make it look good. And if you get 90% there, 95% there, it's a win. You're not going to, you know, you don't want to go to spending weeks and months color correcting your show. Make a good show. They won't notice the colors are a little bit off. So looking at the Lumetri color filter, it's kind of stacked. If you look at this, there's a basic correction. If you click on it, it opens up, and you have some controls. And here, you know, there's a couple ways to look at this. They designed this with a lot of flexibility that you could just go from top to bottom, or you could just use some bits and pieces. So if I go ahead and I select this, now when I start making adjustments here, so if I make this brighter, I'm going to just go with exposure. As I open this up, we notice that what's getting whiter, this is starting to approach 100% white. Premiere is going to try to keep you from overblowing your luminance, okay? If you're not sure what you're doing, it's trying to protect you. And as a matter of fact, with a lot of the color correction, you'll notice there are defined limits to how far you can push the correction. It's sunset, so it can be a little dark, but I may want to open this up a little bit, okay? So I may want to go and work with my exposure. And then I may want to open up the dynamic range and use various sliders. I can also look here. This is my contrast. And ideally, you want that to be a nice mountain range from the top to the bottom, equally nice number of black dots to white dots, or black lights to white lines, dots, lines. I forget these words after a while. This is our RGB. It's pretty equal, you know. Maybe a little more red, but that's natural. Okay, and then we also see in our vector scope, it's not super saturated, but it is going towards the red. And as a matter of fact, you know, we saw with the little dots earlier, you never want to see your color go beyond this frame, because that will be super saturated for your viewer. It'll look really bad. Now, when color correcting, it's always good to look at the before and after to remember where you came from and where you're going. That was our before. A couple sliders. This is our after. The blacks are working with a large chunk of the dark area, and the whites, the large chunk of the light area. The highlights and the shadows, think of them as stepping inside a little bit, where you're working with the nuance of not the quite black areas and not the quite white areas. So you can play with those and still keep the blacks nice and rich and the whites nice and clean, but the highlights and the shadows allow you a little more nuance and flexibility with the stuff that's kind of stepped inside a little bit. When I work with saturation, I want you to notice what happens right here, because that is what is judging how saturated an image is. If I go to the left to make it more black and white, that becomes a dot. There is no color, okay? If I move it to the right, I can push it up. It's actually pretty saturated. If I do anything more, it's going to actually get ugly saturated. I actually don't like to work with saturation. Saturation is nasty because it's equal across all the colors, and it tends to look artificial. I say that because there's a good solution in the next box that we're going to open up. Okay, if I only had saturation, I might deal with it, but I might tweak it a little bit. I do want you to see how it filled this area up. It didn't affect my luminance here at all. Okay, it's only dealing with the color information. I'm going to notch that back a little bit because I know I'm going to fix it in the next area. So let's go back and grab our saturation slider. Now, I haven't done any white balancing. I'm not sure if this even needs white balancing. It's a challenge. If I wanted to try to white balance, and this could be very dangerous, I go ahead and I can click the eyedropper, and I can select what I think would be white in the scene. Now, the challenge is that there probably isn't a lot that's white, but the thing you have to consider when you are selecting what you want to white balance, you want to pick something that is technically neutral gray that probably has a color cast from the scene. So it's gray, but it might be a little blue gray or a little yellow gray. You don't want to go for that brightest area, that bright white area, because there's no color information there. Okay, so it's not really going to fix it right. You want to pick something where there's a shift in the tinting of the color in a gray area. The next thing is the creative. If I click on creative, it brings up another set of controls. Okay, so the basic has closed up, and now we're focusing on this. And some people just stop at this point because you can go ahead and they have all these great little like looks that you can apply to stylize your image. And as a matter of fact, it's a huge list. Okay, so if you want to just give something, you know, a basic look from when you look at all these, you know, film noir, a high dynamic range. You can say, do I like that? No, I do not like that. You can step through and look at them as an icon, and then if you want to apply one, you just click in the middle. So it's kind of a start point. You know, I'll click that, a little bit blue. I'm going to switch this back to none for the time being, and I want to work with a couple of the other sliders. So the big one that I like here is this one called Vibrance. And for those who are familiar with Vibrance from either Lightroom or Photoshop, I think of this as smart saturation. What it does is, if something is not very saturated, it focuses on adding saturation to that area. And if it is already very saturated, it doesn't increase the saturation as much with the slider. So it only saturates the less saturated areas, or desaturates, the highly or heavily saturated areas. Additionally, it tends to lean towards two things, or my understanding is this, that it does pop blues a little bit more, because skies are blue and everybody likes blues, skies look nice. And it also doesn't blow out faces and make them look like that orange as much. In addition, one of the things you can do, and this is really nice, is you can also modify the color of the shadows and the highlights, because sometimes you want to pull shadows to be truly dark or black, or you look at the highlights and they're tinted a little bit, but you don't want to change the entire color of the scene. And that's what these two circles allow you to do. So if I look here and I say, you know what, I want a little less blue in my sky, I would click on the center and I would drag it in the opposite direction of the blue. Okay? And you'll notice it has gone from a hollow circle to a solid circle, and that tells me that I've made a modification. Okay? So I can go ahead and I can tint. You can see as I can move this around. And it's mostly working in the highlights, but things do overlap. And the same thing, I could go into the shadows and say, you know what, there's a lot of blue in there. I pull it to the opposite direction. I have successfully made this very ugly. And to fix it, all I have to do is double click, and it goes back to the center, and I see it being hollow, and I know that I have turned off that parameter. And again, the other thing I do want to point out is there are little stopwatches next to every one of these sliders. So you can change color over time. So if the sun is setting, if the light is changing, if you want to fake a sunset, if you want to change the tint, maybe this is a classic, you're shooting and you're videotaping, you're recording to your media card, and you walk from inside to outside, and inside it's 3200, outside it's 56. There's a moment that maybe it looks blue, because it hasn't auto white balanced yet. So you may actually want to keyframe the color correction to compensate. As it adjusts, you adjust. So the next area, and I'm going to zoom in, this is called curves. Okay, and this is great. A lot of you, again, are familiar with curves in the Photoshop world. And some of you may not have ever used curves. And there's also a different way that we deal with our saturation. The saturation circle is pretty cool. So with curves, you can actually add a lot of punch to a scene by saying, oh, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and I'm clicking right in the upper part. And I want to just limit the control just the highlights. And I want to control just my blacks. Now, I'm doing this in all colors, basically, which is white. Okay, so if you notice, I brought up the shadows a little bit. I brought down the sky a little bit. And I just clicked and it created, a keyframe. I can, if I want to go to the next level, click on any of these buttons and actually work with just curves, if you're good with curves, in just the R, G, or B color space, red, green, and blue. Now this is very interesting. This is the way this circle works. So what this allows me to do is saturate certain colors within my shot. So I could click on the blue and it automatically gives me 3 dots. And those dots are keyframes. And I could go ahead, and what I'm doing is I'm adding saturation to just the blue area, okay, while not saturating anything else. If, let's say, I wanted to go ahead and bring out some of the red, I could go in, and instead of hitting the button, I could click on here to make some points and bring down the red. Maybe I want to bring down. So I'm really able to fine-tune saturation in different bandwidths on this really weird kind of color wheel. We go down here, and again, these are color wheels. We've kind of worked with some of these before, but here's another way that you can control how you color correct. You don't have to use every slider. Your goal is to make it look good. You want to get it good. You want to get it to the point where people aren't saying, oh, that's green, that's blue, that's dark. Okay? This allows us to do two things, control 2 areas of our image. It allows us to work with the luminance values of our shadows, our midtones, and our highlights, which we've kind of had access to before, and also allows us to, once again, tint the color in our shadows, in our midtones, and our highlights. I'm going to my highlights. It's pretty blue. I like where it is. Maybe I'm going to take a little bit of green out of the mid-range. Kind of arbitrary. Yeah, that looks too red. And again, sometimes things don't need fixing. And I'll tell you, it looks better before I messed with it because it's way too pink. Let's go ahead and fix that. We're going to get to secondary. I'm going to work on a different clip for that. Secondary is something new in the latest release of Premiere. And what it allows you to do is work with just one specific color area. You create a mask and be able to tweak that based upon color, color, which is saturation, luminance, and the hue. And at the very bottom is something called vignette. Most of you know what a vignette is. A jargon term for a video or film, they sometimes call it a power window. There's 4 sliders. Take the feather down to 0. Now you have a hard circle, you can actually see what's doing. So when you look at the amount, and I'm going to zoom in here so we can kind of see that. So amount is how strong the black is, or how strong that is. The midpoint, well, that's really the size, you know? It's not changing the location, so that's the size. And then the roundness, now you can see what your vignette looks like. And once you get it where you want, and you get used to it, then you can throw your feather back in. And now you can really see what you're doing. With color correction, I often hit the F key to match frame because it allows me to see very quickly my before and my after. It's a little green, maybe even a little pink, you know, from the red over here. You know, there's my sky. I can see that. As a matter of fact, if you look at the waveform, it's kind of like a graphical representation of what's happening from left to right. You can see the elements. Color-wise, it's meh, but we want to make it better. We can look at the finish because, you know, it's kind of crazy. So this is, you can see what, how easily you can, or not easily, this was all fixed with the Lumetri color filter by going down through those steps. When you're inside the Lumetri color panel, you'll see here that there's 2 panels. One that says master and one that says just the clip, which is 04. Doesn't matter which one of these boxes checked, but this is the master clip, okay, the one that's inside of your project bin. If I go over here to my effects controls, I have the same options. You'll notice I fixed it on this clip that's in the sequence. This is my fix, turned it on and off. But if I look at the master, there's no color filter there. So what I can do, and I'm going to show you this in a couple of examples, is let's say we're not even color correcting at all. Let's say I want to make everything black and white on this reel of film, we'll call it. I can go ahead and I can apply to the master clip, because this is selected as master, okay? Any filter I want. Now, my filters have been relocated because we really weren't using them. Where are my filters? I don't see them, so I'm just going to get them from here. Effects. There they go. And we're going to go and we'll do, we discovered that there is one called black and white. Black and white. And I'm going to actually throw this on the master, okay? And what you see is this just turned to a really ugly color. But the point is, that's because, in reality, this is now black and white. And every time I use any piece of this clip, and if it's a 20-minute clip, it will come in with that correction. I'm going to actually go now apply this color correction to the master of this clip. So every time I load it from the project file, it will already be corrected. So to do that, I'm going to switch back over here to the master, and there's my black and white. I'm going to select it and delete it. I don't want it black and white anymore. That was just for an example. I want to go over here, and this is the clip in the timeline. I'll turn it on so you can see it. I'm going to copy, Command-C. I'm copying every change I made, and this is the clip in the timeline, okay? The master, even though I'm clicking up here, is actually the clip in the project bin. So remember, and this is a little hard to get your head wrapped around. If I did a match frame, this is the clip from here. This is the clip, this is good, this is what I like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just look kind of at the other side that's down here and apply that color correction, okay? Under Effects Control, I'm going to hit Paste, okay? Now in the master, it's all corrected. The reason it looks horrible here doesn't look horrible there, is because if I look at this here, guess what? It has the same color correction on it twice. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. So now what I've done is I've applied it to the master. So anytime I use any part of this clip in my show, it's already correct. It's already neutral. I can still add a look to it. I can still add other filters to it, but I don't have to worry about, oh, I have to go back and paste this in or do that. And it's really nice. So the tricky thing about this is if I load this clip into my timeline and I look at it, I don't know at first blush that there's a filter on here unless I remembered that, okay? Because I would have to look at the master side and then I would see that's there. Every time I open this clip, it looks horrible, but there is no filter on it. If that ever crosses your mind, look at the master side and see if you accidentally pasted something in, and that could cause you to have a few less headaches. Out there, one of the things that's a challenge is scene-to-scene color correction. You can do that by just toggling back and forth and fixing one to make them match to the eye and to the scope. Scopes are really good for matching scenes because as you toggle back and forth, you'll see dramatic changes in one aspect of the scope perhaps, and you see like, oh, there's a little more red. The scope should be very similar between the two shots, and then you can balance that way. Personally, I have done that, but there are some reasonably priced third-party plugins that literally said, I put the filter on, I point to what I want it to match to, it does an analysis, and it gets it really close, and then I can go have lunch and life is happy. So, you know, third-party plugins are great. Sometimes they may seem expensive momentarily, $100. You're like, think of what your time is worth, okay? If you spend 40 hours color correcting and you could do this in 4 with a plugin that allows you to do it faster, you just got 36 hours of time for that $100 you invested. So keep in mind that, yes, you can do a lot of things with what's here. There's some great stuff out there.